Welcome everybody to our last session of our National Arbor Day Webinar Conference hosted by the Canal Forest Restoration Project and Rice Creek Field Station. I'll be kind of hosting this. My name is Kristen Haynes. I'm the Assistant Director of Rice Creek Field Station at SUNY Oswego. I'm going to turn this over to George and Jane Pauk, who are the co-founders of the Canal Forest Restoration Project, and they will be introducing our speaker, Rick Churchill, and the title of Rick's talk is An Old White Oak, How Might One Know?
Well, happy Arbor Day. It's great. The person I'm going to introduce, Rick Churchill. Dr. Churchill is a dear old friend of ours, like I'm old too, but from Maine. He's a Mainer who has lived in rural Maine, a life that's close to nature, and he has mostly been a teacher, an expert on trees, forests, plants, editor of journals. He's been mostly, though, a person who has, to my knowledge, been a bridge between people and plants. And like I've always been amazed to find Rick taking plants to people in the hospital to help them get well. And I think that his academic background is extensive, with connections right now with Arizona University, and it's what he's sort of involved in talking about, I think, today. But he's also been very involved with other colleges and Harvard and so forth as a teacher. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Churchill.
Wow, that's it?
I guess, Rick. You're on. He's a snowshoe guy too. He gives people tours on snowshoes.
Well, thank you, George, and Jane. I'm sure Jane wrote it all, right?
I would have done better.
Yeah. Anyway, I was going to talk about YouTube in probably 5 or 10 minutes, but it doesn't make any sense in doing that. I may as well do it now. George, I think we met in a swimming pool at the Portland Y, and this would have been back in the 80s. And George almost immediately grabbed onto my flipper and said, "Hey, I've got a great idea." And that was the beginning of many great ideas. George and Jane and a whole bunch of my students collected seeds. We illegally put them all over the state of Maine. And to this day, we're probably, people are saying, what the heck is that? How did that tree get here? But anyway, George and Jane became very good friends, and they moved to Arizona, and that sort of got me interested in Arizona, and they've become the type of people that you can't believe the things that they have done. And I'm thankful for them as friends and for all they've done. They're amazing people. And I'm sure, Kristen, you're saying, yeah, that as soon as they got I think they got into the canal without too much trouble. Sure enough, they had to figure out what to do. So along came white pines, and what were those other things that you were trying to plant out there? But white oak, and for sure they will get things done because they're doers. One of the good things that they also do is, and I shouldn't go into this, but they have been involved with helping people all over the world, and in many, many, many ways. And if you go visit them in their house, you're probably going to be asked, well, we're going to do, you can visit, but we have to go downtown today, and could you carry this placard that only weighs 400 pounds? Anyway, it's wonderful to have them doing what they're doing up in New York. So what am I doing? I messed up this program from the standpoint of doing slides, and Kristen has, she's the one who's going to keep track of what I'm doing. And while she's getting that set, whoa, she got it set. That's pretty darn good. I spent probably 400 or 500 hours this week doing nothing, and she figured it out right away. An old white oak, I might want to know. I don't even know where that came from. Kristen, did you come up with that idea? Kristen, you there?
That was all you, Rick.
Oh, that was all me?
Yep.
Well, anyway, I don't even remember doing it, but what I would say is it probably had something to do with the fact that I do some volunteering at the Tree Ring Lab here at the University of Arizona. And one of the things that they're working with is putting the age on various trees. And in most instances, we're not talking about just one tree. We're talking about going back many, 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 many generations where, it might be 5,000 years back. It might be 10,000 years back. So we'll sort of get into the white oak shortly. And I guess the only way that I can give a lecture is I have to see the next slide, because I don't remember what I'm supposed to say next. Oh, and I am supposed to say next, right? Kristen, right? Say yes. I told
Yes.
Kristen, I have been known to be in situations where I would have someone in the audience, I would say, tell the person who's going to show the slides, pull the right ear, and that's to go forward with the slides. Pull the left ear, that's to go backwards. So anyway, I'm not going to have Kristen do that today. I love being out in the woods, always have. I went to an agricultural high school at the age of 13. It was a high school in Massachusetts that was pretty much created for the incorrigibles, individuals that weren't doing real well in their regular schools. And I started at the age of 13 falling in love with trees and agriculture in general. And I've never given it up. And I had this picture taken of me because I like the tree. Turns out it's on a woodlot that I own. And this is a beech, American beech, which many of you should know, particularly from the Northeast. Most of them are dying, and that's unfortunate. We'll talk a little bit about climate change later on, and now we're getting insects and diseases, for example, that are attacking the beech, that those organisms weren't in Maine 25 years ago. So it's a different world. I mean, we are losing people for a virus right now, but we're losing an awful lot of vegetation as well. Next. While we're getting there, George mentioned that I did teach at many, many, many places, and still do a little bit of teaching. My brain is going, my hearing is gone, and it becomes more difficult, but I miss the days of being with students. This is actually out near where I live. This is Gould Academy, which is a prep school in Maine, where every year I go out and teach one day on the spirituality of trees, and it's a wonderful experience. And I got to teach in a lot of wonderful places, and I miss it to this day. Next. I probably 25 or 30 years ago became interested in the spirituality of trees. And people will say to me, what the heck is spirituality of trees? Well, I have a strong belief that trees provide us with more than just lumber or firewood. They're living organisms. And there are things that I find with trees that just are pretty amazing. I listened and saw Cooper in the previous speaker, and he was edging on the spirituality of trees, but didn't get enough time to get into that. But I only say that because I'm going to talk about dendrochronology today, but I can't talk about that without talking about why I care about trees. Next. Now, if you believe in anthropomorphic things, if you're walking in the woods and you saw this, what might you think? Next. Or this. Next.
Wow.
I carve wood, and these are actually the name of these individuals are tree spirits. And I make tree spirits and give them to people who need a tree spirit. Did I give you any, George?
Oh, yes.
Oh, good.
Oh,
Next.
I don't-
If you look at most of the religions of the world, you'll find most of them have a connection with trees, and that's pretty interesting. And when I got involved with spirituality of trees, I had to look at the religions of the world, and to this day, I'm fascinated by that aspect of trees and religion. Next.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't say preach, but I got interested in sharing my interest in trees by someone who was a member of a CC. And what is that? I can't even. Oh, yeah. Universalist Church. I should be able to read that. So I started preaching in these churches, and it's fascinating to share my spirituality in trees. And then when I ask maybe 100 people that are sitting in the pews, could someone just raise their hand and tell me about a tree that was important in their life? Well, 100 people stick their hands up, starting from the tree that I climbed as a kid to the tree that I buried my parents under. And just fascinating to me that just about everyone cares about trees and has a connection with them. Next. That's the one time that I had to put on an outfit because it was at a UU church that had about 28 very elderly, and I shouldn't say this, but they were all women, they were all elderly, and the person who was in charge of getting me there to speak said, "You better dress up. I don't want to see you looking like you always look." Next. I find myself sort of being attracted all the time to trees, particularly because I'm a biker, and while I'm biking, if I see a tree, I'm going to stop. So this is actually in Tucson. I was riding my bike. The sun was shining exactly like this as I took the photograph, and I looked at it, and it was at a novitiate. And so I went and knocked on the door. There were 11 nuns living there, and I became friends with the Mother Superior. And to this day, I love these folks, and I do a little pruning for them. So next, whenever I'm there and I'm pruning, the nuns will be coming up and saying, you remember that tree that you pruned? Well, I don't know what the name of it is. And I say, yes, I know exactly what it is because I said to you, this tree is an arborvitae, and an arborvitae, if you look at it in Latin, it is a tree of life. So the nuns fell in love with those. So every time I go in and I'm pruning, I have to give them a bigger log because they actually fight over the pieces of wood that I give them. And all of them have them in their rooms. It's just fascinating to me and my way of connecting with not only the trees, but connecting with, I'm not a Catholic, but I can certainly look at them and say they are individuals who are beyond my fathoming that how much they do or give to the people that they work with. Next. If you look at kids and you look at trees, I mean, how many of you haven't seen the Loraxia that you have read it yourself, or you've read it to your children or your grandchildren or whatever? Next. This is my second youngest grandson, who is, for some reason, he's very spiritual. This is in my house. You can see I have wood here, there, and everywhere in my house. And Nate, we were piling up, these are called cookies, which we'll get to in a little bit with dendrochronology. But there he was sitting there, and he doesn't go to church. I don't know where he got the hands in place, the eyes closed, and I just watched him for a couple minutes and took a picture, and I said, Nate, what were you doing? He said, I don't know, I just felt I had to do this. Next. There's a whole new area from the standpoint of communication between trees and among trees. And this individual, who's German, he was sort of the forerunner of this, and now there are many researchers, but we now know that trees communicate, and it fascinates me to this day. Next. The communication between a tree often is related to, you can see the root system here, and you can see this feathery growth there, and those are mycorrhizae or fungi. And it's the fungi that go from tree to tree and they communicate. Something that blew my mind in reading his book was the situation where an evergreen will photosynthesize all winter. A deciduous tree most of the time is not photosynthesizing, and an evergreen will provide carbohydrates to a deciduous tree. Now, how does it know to do that? It has to communicate in some way, which is chemically. But anyway, next, what makes me interested. And if you take a look at things like this, a tree stump and a human fingerprint, aren't they pretty close to? Yeah, next. If you look at, and George being a physician, he's probably looked at some x-rays of lungs in his lifetime, and you look at the same patterns that occur in trees that occur within humans. Next. This is a new book that came out and was written by one of the professors at the Tree Ring, and this is a fascinating book for those of you that might be interested. It's just coming out, and I recommend it. Next. Oh, who the heck are they? Man, see, that's where I was going to come in and talk about YouTube. So I already did it, but what a couple, huh? Smile, smile, smile. Next. All right, so there's a couple of trees that on the Erie Canal that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and then swing that into dendrochronology. This is white pine, which white pine, as many of you know, is the state tree in Maine. And it is a tree that has been used in areas that are next to bodies of water, often for the building of ships. Next. And they very easily reproduced, and I understand you're growing some at the nursery there. Next. The lore that is interesting about the white pine, particularly throughout New England, is the fact that King George, I think it was the second or the third, he decided around the year 1700 that because he still was in charge of what became the United States, he would put next the marking on the tree that you see here, and all of these trees, which many of them were as long as 200 feet, and they had to be at least 24 feet in diameter. But they would put this marking on there, and if anyone other than the king's soldiers and loggers took them, then you may very well end up being killed by the King of England. Next. And those were the size of the trees back in around 1700. In Maine, the trees that are there, and Maine is the most forested state in the United States, it is at least 2 to 3 times cut over. So you don't see many of these trees anymore. And with people saying, oh, there's big trees in Maine, well, they're not anywhere near as big as they were in 1700. Next. And this is the range of white pine throughout the Northeast. Next. And this is a old white oak, but wouldn't be all that old, might be 100 years old. White oaks, they can grow a couple hundred years. The white pine, they used to grow a couple hundred years. Now they're lucky to be around 100 years. They have a lot of insect and disease problems associated with them. Some of the oaks do as well. Next. The white oaks that George and Jane are helping grow, they are pretty easily identified because they have lobes that are unique from the standpoint of being rounded rather than pointed. There's many more red oaks which are pointed. And George and Jane, I won't put them on the, no, I won't say. I'll just say they have collected a lot of them. Next.
Nuts.
And this is swamp white oak, which I understand you're growing some of those as well now. And both of them are, both the white oak and the swamp white oak are very dense. They about 75 pounds per cubic foot in those oaks, as compared to a white pine, which may be 20, 25 pounds. So 3 times as dense. Next. So good for building not only boats, but also along the canal. It was used extensively for any place you needed something that was going to survive in water, not survive being alive, but not rot away. And the white oak was the choice. And if you look inside of white oak, we'll see the inside of some trees shortly. there are these things called tyloses that are within the vessels in there, which that keeps them, if you want to build a boat, you just as soon have it not sink. So white oak is good for that purpose. Next. And that's the scientific name of the swamp white oak is Quercus bicolor, and it gets the name bicolor from the undersurface of the leaf being pretty white. Next. So there's the, I guess, well, probably George and Jane saw it when it looked like this, but I didn't. But that's where what it looked like, and often bodies of water, even a canal, you cut down most of the trees around it for various reasons, and that's what happened on that canal. Next, so they're going to grow a lot more. Now, how did I get interested in putting the age on trees? I made a connection with a guy by the name of Alex Shigo. This is him with his green hat on. He introduced me to the biology of the interior of the tree, and I spent probably 20 years learning things from him. A fascinating individual who died too young. Next. He gave lectures all over the world, and he would always start out, you know, some of you in the audience are looking at me and I have my tie on, and more than likely you think I'm just some professor from the University of New Hampshire, which is where he taught. But I'm going to tell you, I have cut over 30,000 trees with a chainsaw to look at the inside. So I'm not just an old professor. I know trees. Next. And what he was interested in was something called compartmentalization, which you can see the center of this tree. It has some tissue that's different from the outer wood, and that's all disease, but the tree was able to compartmentalize. Next. And this is what Shigo came up with. It's called the coded system, where you compartmentalize by creating new tissue that would then keep the tree from dying if it was genetically possible. And so when I came to Tucson, and I'm only here a couple months every year, I knew about the tree lab here on campus, and so I went over and said, I'm Rick Churchill. I love trees. I deal with the inside of trees for years and years and years. What can I do to learn about dendrochronology? And they said, you're a volunteer. You're it. So not it. There are many volunteers, and so that's how I got connected to what I do now most, is dealing with trees that look like this, but they're being looked at for different reasons than everything else that I talked to you about to this point. Next. Shigo was really into, I forgot I had this one, on how a tree actually compartmentalizes on the outer portion of the tree. Next. Oh, I forgot I had Leonardo there. Leonardo was one of the first, and maybe he was the second, but I'll say the first, who discovered that tree rings reveal the age of a tree. Next. Leonardo da Vinci, by the way, he did so many things related to trees that it's amazing. I could go on way too long. Next. So this individual is an individual who showed up in Arizona around, I think it was 1910, 1915. His background was he went to Trinity College in Connecticut, and he studied math, botany, and astronomy. And he ended up being asked by Harvard College to go to Arizona because they want to put in a new telescope. And he was interested in how trees get bigger. So he thought it had something to do with sunspots. So he started researching it. And he also was having the observatory built, but they were logging around him. So he started looking at trees, and he kept looking and looking and looking, and he decided it was the sunspots. Well, he was wrong. But as a researcher, he just kept going at it. Next. And in 1937, he started the tree lab here at the university. Next. And he actually kind of interesting. His first, the entire time that he was dealing with dendrochronology, his office and labs were underneath the football field at the university. This is the new lab. It's about 10 years old, and it is spectacular. He did not live to see this. Next. Loaded with faculty members, loaded with graduate students, and loaded with individuals who are professors in other parts of the world. And I lead groups around to show them what goes on there, and it's fascinating. Next. And everything today is computerized. It's so much easier than the day when you had to just count rings. Now it's all done with computers. Next. Also, this is the biggest lab and the most comprehensive lab in the world. And most of the departments that are in the sciences at the university are part of it. So right now, climate change is the real important part of it, but you have chemistry, you name it. You can major in dendrochronology, or you could be a chemistry major. Next. The trees that's most interested in the United States, this is one that is out in California. The species grows out in the mountains of California, and it's a bristlecone pine. Next, and a lot of work at the lab has been done there. This is a bad photograph, but that piece of wood right there, which came from a bristlecone pine, that's 3,000 years old. So give you an idea how small those rings are. Next. Love them. And those are alive. They have very living tissue left, but they're still alive. Pretty neat. Next. And in the lab, there's a lot of work also going on with fires, particularly with the mega droughts that have occurred in California. And when you're looking at a cookie, and this one doesn't really look like a cookie, right behind it, they got the name cookies. You can figure that out. That's pretty easily. But when you look at a cookie, you can determine when fires occurred, and you can determine many other things as well. Next. So this is what a tree looks like. A tree is a tree on a tree on a tree on a tree. So every year you get a new tree that is on the outside of the previous tree. So if you cut it cross cut, you end up seeing the rings. Next. And sometimes you get something a little different than most rings. Next. So this is what a ring looks like. And you can see that there are derivations in, not derivations, but the naming of various parts of the tree. So you have the heartwood, which is dark in color, usually, not always. And then you have the sapwood, which is light in color. Heartwood is dead for the most part. Sapwood is alive. So most of the tree isn't living tissue. And then the bark, you know, the bark, and some of you have probably heard of the cambium, which allows the tree to increase in size. Also, just to show you on the left side there, the wound, the tree is what Shigo called compartmentalizing. It is trying to heal itself, and he didn't like that term at all, but I use it. Next. And then if you look at the rings, you will see that they are designated, or you're able to cipher what they are. You have early wood, which is what grows in the spring, sometimes called spring wood, and late wood, which is the wood that is developed at the end of the growing season. The late wood is darker in color because of the chemicals that are present, and that gives you the annual ring. It gives you that amount of growth in a particular year. There are some situations where that doesn't always work out exactly. And then the center of the tree is the pith of the tree. So that's the first year of the tree growth. Next. And if we wanted to look at the difference between a conifer and an angiosperm, if you look at all of the voids in there, that's the plumbing system of the wood of the tree, which is the xylem. So you can see that the angiosperms have a lot more openings and a lot more material is able to move through there with these bigger vessels, as opposed to the conifer. There are much fewer of the larger vessel as well. Next. And that would be a conifer. Next. So you can cut down a tree, but if you cut down a tree, then that tree more than likely is going to die. So the other thing that we do is we use a borer. We need to core out not very large, quarter of an inch or so, not much larger than that, not quarter of an inch. Did I say quarter of an inch? Yes, quarter of an inch. I'm going from millimeters to inches, sorry. So you take the increment borer and sometimes it's difficult, you screw it in. Next. And you end up with this relatively small sample. And some people would say it doesn't hurt the tree. Other people say, yes, it does hurt the tree. But you would then take this next and you would remove it, and then you could study it. And one of the things we study is the size of the ring. Next. And if you go into the tree lab, there'll be a graduate student with a big pile like this who has been measuring, again by computer. Excuse me. Next. Next. And if you could see this more closely, there are little spots put on there to indicate the age. So if it's, depending on what it is, if it's one spot, it's 10 years between the 10 spots, and so on and so forth. Next. So if you look at this, a coring, you can see that some of the rings are much smaller than some of the others. So if you look on an annual ring, the ones that are indicated the lightest or brightest, those rings have good growing conditions. And the two things that are most important, or the one thing that is definitely most important, is the amount of water that the tree gets. The other is temperature. Next. One of the things that was done for many, many years and still is done, you can take a cookie and you can go back in years and years, in this instance back to what was it, 1489. This would be a tree that was still alive in 1971. So anyway, that's one of the things that's done. Next. Now, here's an important part. You go up to the Erie Canal and you see trees that are growing, and you want to know, how long did a white pine grow in this area? Did it go all the way back to glacial time? So what you can do is you can cut down a pine tree, or you can bore it, and you can determine how old it was, and you can determine the size of the rings. Well, that's not going to get you back to 11,000 years ago during the glacial age. So then you see this old cabin that's next to the Erie Canal, and you say, geez, look, it's a wooden cabin. So you find a beam and you take a core out of that beam, and you find some, and this is fascinating, you find some rings that match the tree that you just took a coring from, except that cabin was built in 1800. So it couldn't come from that tree. So you can match them. And so this is called cross matching. And then you notice, oh, there's a pond over there. It looks like that's been there for a long time. Or it's the canal. You go down the 7 feet in depth of the Erie Canal and you pull out a log that's been there for who knows how long. And whoa, you can match some of the rings again in a different place. And then you go to another pond and or the canal, and you find it. So you can keep going back. And there are trees now that have gone back almost to 10,000 years by doing this and using the computers today. It's much easier to do it. Next. This is how they do the cabin, by the way. They find a beam and you just bore it out. Next. Bunch more. Next. And these are some that go back into, and I can't even see it, 1700. And you're just cross matching. Next. So two important things to remember. During a dry year, you get a small ring. During a wet year, you get a bigger ring. So drought conditions, bad for most trees. Next. And temperature, it depends on the trees and where they're growing. But typically, if you have very, very, very cold weather, you're not going to get a lot of growth. If you have hot weather, you're not going to get a lot of growth. So you have to have the temperature that is suited for the particular tree. I'll tell you one thing about New York and Massachusetts, that if George, Jane, and I were around 50 years from now, we're not going to be. Kristen, you'll have to check this out. 50 years from now, there will be no spruce and no fir in Maine until you get to the Canadian border. They'll be gone because the temperatures will be that warm. Next. Now, I'm going to have someone ask a question, but I wanted to have this in here, and it's amazing because Cooper, who spoke just before me, he was taking music from trees, and he's not alone. This is actually an individual from Germany as well, where you take a cookie and you usually use lasers, and you get music from the tree itself. So that said, the filming is over, and if I'm smart enough, I've made it almost to the end, and then I won't have to answer any wicked hard questions because I know Kristen has been writing things down here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I think I told you, Kristen, that I have never done anything in the way of speaking to the time that I've been told. So sorry.
You're doing just fine.
But before I forget it, I tried to ask 2 questions of Cooper and I couldn't get through. So I don't know if you have people who are trying to ask questions who are as dumb as I am. And
Oh, okay. Should I stop sharing, Rick? You done with your slides?
Yeah.
Okay. So for anybody who's watching on YouTube, I guess hopefully most people aren't experiencing technical challenges, but you should be able to submit questions via live chat. You might have to sign in to Google to do so. What did I do here?
You didn't tell me that.
I don't know that occurred to me before you just mentioned that you had a problem. Yeah, so let me see if we have any questions. Okay. Okay, so far we have one question. And again, if you want to submit a comment or a question, I can pass those on to Rick. Technically, we'll cut off at 5, but we have a little more flexibility because nobody's coming after Rick. So let's see, our first question is, does this compartmentalization happen uniformly around the circumference of a ring, or can it be one-sided, as in compartmentalization on the left side or the right side of the tree?
Well, compartmentalization is, as Shigo created it, he said there are 4 walls that occur, and they are above and below. That's wall 1. Wall 2 is both sides. Wall 3 is a ring. And wall 4 is out where the bark is. So the question being, does it happen? It happens almost always in a pattern. But you can have, let's say, wall 2, you can have that have a wound after the first wound, and therefore it's been breached, and therefore you don't have it that way. But if you look at, if you went back to the slide that I showed where there was decayed wood in the center, you can see that was very uniform as to how it was compartmentalized. And compartmentalization also is genetically important, because you can have 1 million trees in a forest and find that 2 of those beech trees that I was talking about, 2 of those beech trees that survive and all the others don't. The 2 that survive, depending on what it was that caused the problem, may be very good at compartmentalizer. So in my woodlot, which is only 20 acres, but where I'm cutting the beech down, if I find any trees that don't have the symptoms that you saw on me in the first slide, then I may have a genetically superior beech that maybe my grandkids will name it after me. Hope that answered that question. What's the wicked one that you're going to ask me?
I hope not too wicked. Let me see. So are there any species that don't produce rings? So I'm kind of dredging this up from memory of the past, but like tropical species.
Right. Yeah, I've spent time teaching actually in Costa Rica, and I was teaching tree biology there, and I was dumb as a log. Fortunately, they were all US students, so they were dumb as a log too. And so I'm looking at this tree, and it had been cut down, and I'm saying, and we're going to be able to put the age on this tree. And I look, there's no rings. But there are trees, tropical trees, that do have rings. But those that don't, the reason they live in a climate where everything is similar. If you live in a climate that's tropical, where you have a rainy season and a dry season, if it's rain season the whole season, and not the whole season, the whole year, you don't get the rings. Did you go to a tropical forest at some point?
I have, but it was a, just a temperate forest ecologist, I think, who told me this. Interesting. Yeah. So if you have that seasonality, even if it's like a dry, wet season, then you'll still get a ring. If you don't have the seasonality, you probably won't.
Right.
Interesting.
Make George ask me a question.
Okay, yeah, George.
Well, I have a wicked question. What, like white oaks, they hybridize, and then the leaves look a little different and so forth. And but I think that they can revert to the classical white oak shape. How does that genetics work?
I have no idea, Jane. I'm not a geneticist. I don't know.
Now that was a wicked question.
Gotcha.
The interesting thing about woody plants in particular, I don't want to use the term. Maybe I will use the term. many woody plants are promiscuous, and that's a botanical term. And so you can take a white oak and not a white oak, a white birch and a gray birch, and they will hybridize. And what is the definition of a species? See, I'm asking you, George.
Well, you see, that's why I asked that question, because I think I know there's that the genetics is so complex that it's not like the chestnut researchers. They seem to have found some really good facts and information about the genetics. But I'm asking you because I really haven't seen the trees hybridize and then revert in my lifetime. I mean, but you're saying it's known to happen, right?
It's known to happen, but I don't know anything about the white oak.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to, at some point through evolution, the white oak and the red oak
You
were
would
the
have
same.
to,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, but I don't think we're gonna live long enough.
Yeah.
But if you want to see that occurring, I mean, you've got birch forests throughout New York and New England and whatnot. So if you go and look, and you can tell a difference between a white oak, a white birch and a gray birch, and then you'll see one that looks, well, gee, it really doesn't have a lot of the black lenticels that are on the gray birch, and so you can see them. But who wants to do that? I'd rather go have a beer. What time is it?
Okay.
All right. I have one more question. So you had a slide that mentioned missing or false rings. And I think you did say that, if it's a really dry year or something, a tree might not put out a ring, but what is a false ring?
A false ring is a ring that looks like a ring, except the way to decide that it's a false ring is it doesn't go all the way around. So you will see, like maybe of 24 inches, only 2 or 3 inches of the ring looks like a ring, but it isn't. And how it becomes that, I would assume something interfered with the development of the ring, and therefore the rest of the tissue said, hey, you're done. You're not a good enough ring. So that answer it? Maybe.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, we're getting to the top of the hour. Rick, George, Jane, any last thoughts? Anything you want to share?
Thank you.
So on behalf of, the Canal Forest Restoration Project and Rice Creek Field Station, we want to thank everybody who tuned in to watch. If you had questions that you didn't have time to submit or you had any technical difficulties, you could always reach out to us at canalforestrc@gmail.com, and we can kind of try to address your questions or pass them along to Rick. And we wish you a very happy Arbor Day.
Thank you.